I'm joining you live from sunny California, from Los Angeles, from LA. Please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. Always makes me very happy to know that we're communing around the world. So please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining me from. Hello, India. I see you. This is going to be a 45-minute introductory lecture on the Freudian, Lacanian, Zizekian concept of das Ding, or the thing. Basically, this live stream series that I've been hosting for the past 3 years is supposed to be a series of introductory lectures where I try to take really difficult and complicated concepts and I try to explain them in a way that hopefully makes them accessible without dumbing them down too much. So I try to use examples, I try to explain it in a way that will be accessible for beginners, but also hopefully enriching for those of you who have already studied philosophy and theory. So today we're going to be focusing on the concept of das Ding, which is a psychoanalytic concept, but with multiple philosophical implications. So basically, if you stick around, you'll learn about das Ding, the thing. You'll learn about the Lacanian objet petit a, one of his most famous concepts. And I'll also try to explain the title of Slavoj Žižek's most well-known book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, which also relates to das Ding. Now, if you'd like to follow more of these lectures, they're part of a series focusing currently on the death drive. And basically the idea is that every 3 months, or for 3 months, I host a series. So we've just finished a series on Hegel and on the concept of the night of the world, all of which is saved on YouTube and Instagram. And if you stick around for the next lecture series, it'll be about the death drive. So that's what we are going to be doing for these coming months. Thank you once again to all of the patrons who continue to allow me to have these lectures be open access and free for everyone. It's a huge pleasure and a privilege that I get to host this space with you. And it's really only possible for me to do this full time, for me to do this with all the prep that goes into it, because of the patrons. So thank you to all of our patrons from around the world. You know who you are. And if you'd like to become a patron, as a patron, you can download my ebook. You can download the transcripts for all of these lectures and also the audio downloads. Plus, I host a seminar every week after the lecture where you can ask follow-up questions and I try to answer them for you. And then I post that as a podcast for patrons as well. Anyway, enough about that. Thank you to the patrons. Let's jump right in. So where to begin? Das Ding is a difficult concept, but I think we can try to make it a little bit simple. At least that's going to be my attempt here. Essentially, and I'm trying to figure out where we can start to make it easy. I'm going to give you a 60-second explanation, which will radically simplify it, and then I'll try to expand upon it. So, from a Freudian Lacanian perspective, das Ding is a kind of void, a kind of primordial loss around which the subject is structured. Now, there's a difference between Freud and Lacan when it comes to this loss. For Freud, the fundamental loss is the loss of the mother. Therefore, the subject's desire revolves around the desire to be with the mother. Lacan problematizes this by saying, what would happen if you would actually achieve your goal, being reunited with the mother? Well, strictly speaking, then the animating foundation of the subject would disappear. After all, if you've achieved your desire, then you've overcome your loss. And if your subjectivity is predicated on this loss, then your subjectivity would fade away as well. And so Lacan essentially argues that what we really desire is to never recover our loss, to circle around our loss over and over again. Therefore, our relationship to the void, to the lack in the other, is constitutive of our own subjectivity. This means that for Freud, loss is an absence between two things, you and the thing you've lost. Whereas for Lacan, the absence lies within you. The absence is constitutive. It's a constitutive negativity, if you will, around which the subject is created. And therefore, the secret desire is precisely to sustain your loss, to never overcome it. That's one of the fundamental principles of Lacan's radicalization of the Freudian pleasure principle, or Lacan's formula of desire. That what you desire is not the object of your desire, which for Freud would be the object you have lost, but instead you desire desire itself, which is another way of saying that you desire to sustain your loss. Therefore, you become your loss embodied. Now, how does this relate to Das Ding? And I hope the leaf blower outside isn't too audible for people. I apologize for that. How does it relate to Das Ding? Well, for Freud, Das Ding, the thing, is therefore related to this object which is lost, that you have been severed from. And therefore your drive revolves around overcoming this loss. Whereas the Lacanian argument is that Das Ding is the animating principle of subjectivity itself. It's an empty place. It's not an object. It's a void. It's a void that is constitutive to the subject, which in fact can and never should be filled. Now, it's important to note here that from a Lacanian perspective, Lacan is making a structuralist argument. Now, what makes it structuralist? Structuralism, if you're not already familiar with it, is essentially a form or a theory of linguistics. It's about the relationship between signs and signifiers, between what something is and what it represents. And Lacan is essentially making a structuralist argument about desire and subjectivity. I'll give you an example. It's an example that I came across in this masterpiece of a book by Michel Mari called Verdigris. It's an Italian novel. And in this novel, there's a character, a gardener, who begins to lose his memory, which means that he cannot remember the name of things. And so he comes up with this ingenious, or seemingly ingenious, solution, which is to create mnemonic bridges so that he can remember what things are called. For example, he really likes sausages. So he takes a sausage and he puts a pin in it and he puts it on the wall. However, as the narrator of the book, a young boy, points out, if you simply pin a sausage onto the wall, then it's going to go off. It'll rot. It'll smell. It'll become deeply distasteful. Therefore, as a sign, it's inadequate. The sausage cannot be a sign for itself. The man who's losing his memory can't put a sausage on the wall to remind himself that he loves sausages. Now, he could paint a sausage, but if he painted a sausage, then he wouldn't necessarily even know what a sausage is, right? He would lose the word itself. He would have the image of a sausage, but he would have lost the word. And so the boy comes up with a solution. Instead of pinning the sausage to the wall, the man pins an empty can of tomato sauce to the wall, as well as a picture of an old woman. And when he looks at these, what he sees is sauce and age. Sauce, age, sausage. And thereby, through the picture, or through the can of sauce, and the picture of an old woman, he can combine sauce and age and create sausage. Now, of course, as you will no doubt have already noticed, this process opens up an abyss of signification, which is to say, well, then how can he remember what sauce is? And how can he remember what age is? Which means that he has to come up with other metonymic devices so that he can remember what those pictures stand for. And before he knows it, his entire room is filled with images and signs devoid of their signifiers that are trying to remind him of something else, that mean one thing that he can only find by digging deeper. It becomes an abyss, essentially. This problem, the problem as to the sequence, the open-ended signifier, if you will, is the problem of structuralism. One of the problems that structuralism preoccupies itself is this sequence, seemingly open-ended or infinite, of signification. How does one thing come to represent another? And how do we then infer from that thing that something else represents something else? And this isn't just on the level of words and their meanings. This is also on the level of social signification. Think about, for example, what your brand of car says about you. There's many layers of meaning that we are therefore caught or trapped in, because one thing signifies something else, which signifies something else, and so on and so forth. This means that strictly speaking for Lacan, as I said before, his interest in the Freudian thing, das Ding, is structuralist. Because das Ding is the void or the empty space beyond signification, that which cannot be signified, save perhaps for the absence of its signification. Now, this means that we have two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, we have an object, which is a kind of holy grail, a thing which represents itself autonomously or completely, which therefore is pure. It doesn't rely on signification by means of being represented by something else. You have to imagine some ideal entity that when you gaze upon it, immediately, somehow, almost telekinetically, makes its meaning known to you. There's nothing, no secondary layer of signification. It is pure in that sense. It represents itself. However, strictly speaking, and this is the other side of the coin, this means that this sublime object, something which represents itself authentically, would therefore also be horrific. After all, if it does not rely on a secondary signification, something that translates it into meaning, this means that it is utterly strange and unknowable to us, something that stands against all other horizons of meaning, something that cancels it out fundamentally. For those of you in the comments who are curious, the book I'm talking about is Verdigris by Michel Marie, which is a wonderful novel. And I'm using it to talk about structuralism and the Freudian Lacanian idea of the thing. This means that the thing, as I already pointed out earlier, is not an object. If you will, it's a concept for the idea of an object which signifies itself, and yet which therefore and therein is both sublime and yet horrific. Now, I want to give you another example from this book before we delve deeper into psychoanalysis. One of the obsessions in this book, if you will, das Ding, the thing that occurs in this book that makes everything else unravel, the whole system of meaning, is the slug. This is a book about slugs. There are many, many slugs in this book. And the book begins, in fact, with a seeming act of violence in which the gardener severs a slug into two pieces, thereby effectively killing it. In fact, the opening paragraph is printed on the book. That's how you know it's important, right? And the slug in this book becomes a metaphor for the idea of das Ding, the impossible, sublime, real, the limit at the heart of all signification, and therefore at the heart of the symbolic order. And the metaphor works like this. The slug itself seems to be an object or an animal derived of any outward features. Worse yet, when you sever it with a spade, it appears to the eye to turn into two slugs. It seems to simply duplicate itself. Plus, it's hard to tell, unless you're familiar with slugs, where the beginning of the slug is, where the end of the slug. The slug is like an amorphous thing, something that resists signification, something that exists as a kind of blob. In fact, at a certain point in the book, the narrator goes into the cellar where he finds a barrel filled with slugs. And it's like 1,000 slugs that all appear to turn into one giant king slug, as it were. And in the novel, when the slug is severed, a chain of signification is unleashed that unravels all the other meanings in the world and in the book. But I won't spoil it for you. This is no accident, the equation of the idea of the slug with this idea of the horrific real, or the sublime real, or das Ding, or the thing. Slavoj Žižek, in his own writing on Freud and Lacan, has pointed out how Hollywood often has examples of the Freudian thing. Think about in Alien, the chest burster monster that comes from within. Think about the horror film, The Thing, in which we have an unknowable alien being that exists within one of the crew members. The symbolization of this void, of this abyss that lies at the heart of all meaning, is therefore one of the animating features of the uncanny, or a horror movie. That which cannot be known or which cannot be seen comes into the light to devour us. It's the return of the repressed, if you will. And I don't just say that to sound fancy, because Lacan himself was interested in the idea of the Freudian repressed. In fact, one of the questions that Lacan asks himself in his work is, what is it exactly that is being repressed in Freudian repression? Because it's not satisfying to simply say that what is being repressed is sexuality, which wouldn't be Freudian, it would be Victorian in a sense. And Lacan's answer is twofold. One, what is being repressed is the thing. It's the real. It's the limit, the internal limit in the signifying chain, which I'll explain in a moment. But secondly, and this is the more radical consequence of that conclusion, this means that what is being repressed is repression itself. That if repression is constitutive to the symbolic order and the participation therein, that fundamentally what has to be repressed is repression. Repression, therefore, suddenly becomes analogous to the very thing it's repressing. Remember that the thing has two sides to it. On the one hand, the beautiful, sublime object, which represents itself, which doesn't require signification through something exterior to it. But secondly, the horrific thing which therefore represents the unknowable, the limit to the signifying chain, that which seemingly stands against everything we know and experience to orient ourselves in reality, and yet somehow is supposed to be the key or the solution to it. I'll explain this more in one of the subsequent lectures, but this is also why Slavoj Žižek argues that he is a death drive Marxist, because the death drive for Freud is the animating principle of das Ding, or the thing, the energy that revolves around this primordial loss, which Lacan therefore then links to structuralism and to the loss implicit in signification. And Zizek then makes the leap from Freud to Lacan to Marxism by means of saying that revolution is das Ding, that the idea of revolution isn't a battle between classes, but it's the immanent internal limit that emerges through the reproduction of capitalism. Therefore, the thing from the horror movie, or the chest burster from Alien, is revolution. It's the return of the repressed. It's not something antithetical. It's something that comes from within the internal contradictions. But I'll explain that in one of the other lectures, because this is already getting complicated enough. And I really am trying to simplify it without dumbing it down. Now, to return to Lacan. Lacan, as Zizek points out, goes through different stages when it comes to his analysis of das Ding, or the thing. The first stage is, strictly speaking, structuralist, where Lacan basically is interested in how things are signified. For example, what I said before in the book. If sausage represents something that you like to eat, then how do you remember the word sausage if you're losing your memory? You could put a can on the wall that represents sauce, and you could put up a picture of an old woman that represents age. Therefore, you've created a metonymic device that allows you to, in your head, say sauce, age, sausage. But this opens up an infinite abyss of signification. More and more things have to be linked to each other, and therefore you are lost. You fall into this abyss. Secondly, Lacan becomes interested in relating the idea of das Ding, and therefore the death drive, to the symbolic order. And Lacan essentially argues that the symbolic order is the death drive. Now, let me try to explain first what the symbolic order is. Lacan has a famous triad between the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. The imaginary is how you invest or attach yourself to reality. For example, you could be the son or the daughter of a parent. You are a father or a mother yourself. You are a member of a nation state. You are a member of a religion. You have a favorite soccer team. You have friends who enjoy playing the same games, etc. There are many ways in which we constitute our subjectivity by means of imaginary attachments. This doesn't mean that they're not real. It means that they have to be invested in by the subject through imaginary relationships. For example, when I watch a basketball game, I'm very excited when the Celtics win. But the Celtics don't know I exist. My relationship as a Celtics fan is therefore entirely imaginary. This means for Lacan that the imaginary is how we situate ourselves in the world. The symbolic is, if you will, the supplement to that, which is that if the imaginary is how we invest ourselves in reality, then the symbolic is how this investment is returned back to us, given back to us, as it were. Namely, the symbolic is the structure or the system of relations that emerges when everyone imaginarily invests themselves in each other and in the world. Therefore, the symbolic comes through in social customs, social mores, but also in actual laws, things that you are supposed to do and not do. In other words, the symbolic order is the system which appears as natural, hence the ideological component of it, which appears as natural or as innate, that tells you how to act or how to behave, so that there is a background or a backdrop against which you can invest yourself imaginarily. And so the imaginary and the symbolic for Lacan are dialectically entwined, which is to say, the symbolic is constituted by the imaginary, but the imaginary nevertheless hinges on the fertile soil of the symbolic. This is where the real comes in. For Lacan, the real isn't simply the third category that follows the imaginary and the symbolic. Instead, the real is the void or the kernel that lies beyond the, if you will, encapsulation of the imaginary and the symbolic. Which is to say, the symbolic appears to you as innate or natural. Of course, this is how the world works. And the imaginary appears to you as innate or natural. Of course, you are an authentic subject. Whereas the real is the void that lies within this dialectical interrelationship. No imaginary without symbolic, and no symbolic without imaginary. This means that, strictly speaking, the symbolic is imaginary, inasmuch as the imaginary is symbolic. It's overdetermined by the symbolic, and the symbolic is overdetermined by the imaginary. Now, to a certain degree, everybody knows this. Everybody is aware of the fact that the symbolic is arbitrary. Of course, sometimes brutally so. And everyone invests themselves arbitrarily. For example, if you're stopped at a traffic light, you might convince yourself that there is some karmic reason why the light is or is not turning green. This means that you've created a narrative by which you can integrate yourself into the contingency of the symbolic exchange. On a psychological level, this happens even when it comes to grief or loss. You lose someone, and you keep thinking to yourself, maybe it was caused by this contingent thing I did, or maybe there's something that I should have done. It's like you blame yourself for the loss because you're trying to create meaning out of something that is meaningless, something that resists symbolization. Because what is grief, if not the severance of all signification? But this void creates a necessity to signify more, to create more meaning, to create substitutes for what has been lost. This means that the real is the void that lies at the heart of all signification, which is to say, there's a gap in the symbolic order that can only be filled by the subject through the imaginary attachment. And there is a gap in the subject which can only be filled by means of the symbolic order making itself feel present. This means that, strictly speaking, for Lacan, this lack is the lack in the other. And one of the fundamental fantasies for Lacan is therefore that other people don't experience this lack. I'll use an example that's slightly too clinical here, but nevertheless perhaps helpful. When you look at a famous person, you might imagine to yourself that they have it all figured out. Of course, the reality is that they don't. They themselves are simply a normal human being trying to get through life who happen to have an extraordinary amount of attention placed upon them. However, we would rather think of them as ideal subjects, as idols, to fill an empty space in ourselves so that we can think about how we would like to be. Think about it. When a perfume is sold to you, the message is never, would you like to smell nice? The message is, would you like to smell like your idol? Would you like to inhabit this imaginary space of completion where someone actually exists? This is one of the paradoxes of the real, which is that your own subjectivity or existence seems unreal, but other people seem extra real. And so we try to ground or hinge our own subjectivity in and through others. This is, of course, also why you should never meet your idols, because as soon as you meet your idol, they become an ordinary human being. It's not even about whether or not they're a good person or a bad person, like you idolize them, but they disappoint you. It's that even if they're a good person, they've lost their function to you, which is to exist as an ideal. As soon as they become someone you've met or an acquaintance or even a friend, then they're simply another person. This relates to the Lacanian theory of the sublime. For Lacan, the sublime is, and this is the clearest definition, the object elevated to the level of the thing. We're back at das Ding, the thing. So let's take that apart. What is an object elevated to the level of the thing? Well, think about a sacred relic. It could be, could be a pinky bone from a presumed saint. Here we have an ordinary object, a piece of bone, which is worshipped and imbued with all manner of spiritual attention and energy. Therefore, an ordinary object, everyone has a pinky bone, or almost everyone, I imagine, suddenly becomes an object of worship. It's no longer an ordinary thing, which means that, strictly speaking, for Lacan, it has become sublime. The object has been elevated to the level of the thing. Now remember, the thing for Freud and for Lacan is not a physical object, but instead an empty space, a loss of the object. And now you can realize that when Lacan says that the sublime is the object elevated to the level of the thing, he's making a dialectical, almost Hegelian argument, which is that is the elevation of the object to the level of the thing, which therefore inasmuch means that it is the downward movement, the negation of the object into its own loss, into a constitutive negativity. Think about, again, the object of worship, a relic. It's an ordinary material thing that becomes imbued with spiritual qualities. This means that it is elevated to the level of the thing, but inasmuch negated into a non-thing, into a nothing, as it were. The meaning of the object is, if to use a clinical term, sentimental. It's not about the bone. There's no special quality that makes the bone of a saint somehow better than the bone of an ordinary individual. It's the very act of sanctification that renders the ordinary object into the ideal one, which therefore means that it has lost its material features. It has been elevated, but also in a weird way denigrated or negated. It's an object as its own loss. That is what idealization is. Idealization is the object as its own loss, a constitutive negativity, an abstraction that is sublated from the object. This means that for Lacan, das Ding, or the thing, is loss as its own object. It is that which is a constitutive negativity, both idealization and negation, two sides of the same coin, around which the subject orients himself. This means that for Lacan, the symbolic order follows the same logic. There is no manual where all the rules of society are written down. Sure, we have the Constitution, and yet the Constitution itself is up for debate. The point is that the interrelationship of subjects through societal engagement, through imaginary participation, therefore elevates the idea of society to the level of the thing. Namely, it's not simply the material reality, it's the idea of a society as such, which means ethics, it means morality, it means the ideology that infuses the supposed necessity or innate authenticity of our interactions with meaning. I'll give you an example. For Slavoj Žižek, the definition of ideology is that which, is that which gives meaning to the chaos of our desires. In other words, it's a system. The This is where Zizek is actually quite structuralist, building upon Lacan. It's a system of meaning. It's not a pre-packaged ideology that tells you what to think. Instead, it's a set of coordinates which are presented to you as innate or natural that you are supposed to follow so as to find yourself as a subject. This can be blatant, like the ideology of you should be the first person to arrive at the office and the last person to leave. But it can also be insipid, like the idea that if you're not productive or if you're not working, you're not even really alive. This means that ideology is what infuses our imaginary participation in the symbolic order with the illusion of an innate or naturalized necessity that is therefore not strictly speaking imposed upon us, but that we impose upon ourselves. This is why, and this is where I want to end, this is why, or this is how, you can understand the title of Slavoj Žižek's book, The Sublime Object of Ideology. Now, you have all the pieces already if you followed this lecture. The sublime object for Lacan is das Ding. It's the thing. It's the ordinary object elevated to the level of the thing, ergo sublime. Therefore, for Lacan, the sublime object is das Ding. It's the thing, the real. And the sublime object of ideology is therefore the real of ideology, or, for Zizek, the commodity, capital. Zizek's argument is Marxist. It's a critique of capitalism. The sublime object of ideology is nothing more and nothing less than capital. Because think about it, capital is the object elevated to the level of the thing. The object of money elevated to the level of pure idealized abstraction. Wealth which generates more wealth. There's a great joke about this, actually, in, I think it's the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, where Elizabeth says to the colonel or the lieutenant or something, she says, "I thought honor was the currency of the nation." And he replies, this is very structuralist, very Lacanian. He says, "No, currency is the currency of the nation." And here we're back at the tautology of the sublime object, or das Ding. The idea of a sublime entity which represents or signifies itself purely, which doesn't succumb to the open-ended chain of signification. And what is capital, if not the idealized substance of a signifier which signifies itself? And yet, of course, it can't. The real of capitalism is that this idealized substance of capital nevertheless has to ground itself through material and imaginary participation of willing subjects. This is how you can understand the Marxist idea that what is reproduced in capitalism is not profit, but a capitalist subject. That capitalism reproduces capitalist subjects who willingly participate as if the system were innate or natural. Therefore, in the reproduction of themselves and their subjectivity, they reproduce the machine. They reproduce the system, which is the system of social relations necessitated for the reproduction of capitalism and the capitalist subject. This means that within capitalism, the idea of capitalism as being an innate or natural necessity, the highest order of being, becomes intertwined with a willing participatory subject who enacts the imaginary participation which fuels the symbolic order through which capitalism reproduces itself. And the sublime object underlying this dialectical exchange is capital, the idea of capital. And think about it. Even the way in which you talk about yourself might be infused by this ideology. Have you invested in yourself, right? To invest in yourself is a bourgeois framing that the idea of your subjectivity is like a portfolio that can be invested in properly. Ideology, therefore, infuses the chain of signification with meaning. And Zizek's argument is that the kernel, the abyss, the real that lies behind contemporary chains of signification, the ideology, if you will, is capitalist, which means it is the ideology of capital. And therefore, Zizek's title for his most well-known book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, is to say that the sublime object equals das Ding, equals the real, equals capital. Namely, the sublime object of ideology is capital. It is the commodity form. Now, there's one last thing that I'd like to add here, which will lead us into our next lecture. One thing that I've omitted, but which you should know, is that Lacan comes to a third stage. Remember I said Zizek exemplifies 3 stages in Lacan's thinking about the death drive and das Ding. Number 1, we have a purely structuralist attitude, which is to say a linguistic one about the chain of signification, something which signifies itself, an ideal object, and yet a horrific one. And secondly, we have the idea of the symbolic order. We have the notion that the symbolic order has to be imaginarily invested in, once again this term, by the subject. Therefore, the symbolic order becomes das Ding. The death drive becomes equated with the symbolic. But the third stage of Lacan's thinking is to then take this structuralist argument and this argument about the symbolic order and to return to the idea of the objet petit a. And Lacan's argument is that das Ding, the thing, is nothing more and nothing less than the objet petit a. And therefore, if you follow this argument to its conclusion, Slavoj Žižek's argument in the sublime object of ideology is that the sublime object is das Ding, and das Ding is the objet petit a, which in contemporary ideology is capital, or the commodity form. And therefore, Zizek's argument about the sublime object of ideology might as well be the objet petit a of ideology. And what I'd like you to know at the end of this lecture, which I will explain in the next one, is that the objet petit a for Lacan, which is one of his fundamental concepts about desire, is therefore and finds its origins in the Freudian das Ding, or loss as its own object, constitutive negativity, the sublime object and the petit object, the objet petit a, which I will explain next week. Next week, we will continue this lecture series on the death drive. If you want to watch the previous one, you can find it on Instagram and YouTube. I've introduced a lot of things, but hopefully there's food for thought there. If you'd like to download all of the lectures, you can find them on my Patreon. And of course, if you're a patron, you can join me for the seminar, which I'm going to be hosting right after this lecture, which I also post for patrons. A huge thank you to everyone joining me from around the world, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.